Okay, this is your instructor, Mr. White again. Um, I should talk to the hair people, my hairdresser, before I do these video things. Um, the and this I want to do a sort of recap of the this is just to say discussion. I thought it was a really great discussion board. I thought things were are going really well on our discussions so far. That's very, very nice. There's a couple things that I wanted to talk about so you guys have in mind. If, for example, you want to write about this poem, this would be something. Should I look? Should I look there? Should I look at the screen? Um, this would be something, things that you to think about if you go to write about this with one of your poetry paragraphs. Something to consider. I asked the question: what kind of person would write this poem? What kind of person would say the things that are being said in this poem? And think about there was I had the announcement that was kind of like a little mini lecture about the idea of speaking voice, and that is a literary term. And I wanted you to think of speaking voice um, as in the poem, to say the poem has a speaking voice is to think of the poem like you would think about a line of dialogue, lines in a play. So, for example, the words in the play in Hamlet, the words that are Hamlet's words, those create his character. So if you would think that we could think of this poem, this is just to say a sort of a fragment from a play, fragment of dialogue, and there'd be a character who would speak this dialogue. And one of the advantages of using this term speaking voice is it helps us put some distance between the idea of the speaker of the poem, the words in the poem, and the poet. It doesn't necessarily have to be the words of the poem, don't necessarily have to be the words of the poet, the words, words that we attribute to the poet. If you think about like a Hamlet, like Shakespeare's Hamlet, the things Hamlet says, those aren't things that Shakespeare's saying. It's not like Shakespeare's writing an essay and Hamlet's ideas are Shakespeare's ideas. He can have a character say that thing. So you could write like a detective story. You could write, well, let's say like the Silence of the Lambs. I don't know how. That's a really old movie, but they take any or sort of contemporary movie that features a serial killer, like Silence of the Lambs had a couple of them. And the dialogue words that are given to those characters are not necessarily the thoughts of the author. The author's just creating a character. As far as I know, none of the guy who wrote Silence of the Lambs, or no one who's written any movie scripts about serial killers actually, believes in serial killers, but they can create characters that sort of enact these kinds of things. Well, poems can work the same way. With a poem, you sort of enacting, creating this character based on the words in the poem. Now, I asked you what kind of person would say these things, and you guys had a lot of great responses to that. I thought you really investigated that really well. Another follow-up question would be, what kind of person would hear this? What kind of person was this written toward? And maybe a way to have that make more sense is, if this is an apology, as it seems like it should be, or at least is pretending to be, what kind of person could you write an apology like this for? I mean, a number of you sort of pointed out that it's not a very forthright or sincere apology, or it's not as forthright or sincere as it could be. A lot of you commented on that. I think there's a lot to be said for that idea. What kind of person would take this? If the person who is speaking this had in mind a particular reader, the person who owned the plums, why did they think that they could get away with saying the things that they could say? And there was I'm sorry, the name's escaping me. I failed to write it down. At least one person made a comment that they thought that this would have to be written to someone, a friend or a family member. It would have to be someone that knew, if you were the speaking voice in this poem and you were saying these words, it would have to be someone that knew you really well in order for you to be able to get away with this. The idea of like at the office fridge, earlier in the discussion there was a lot of mention of things getting stolen from the office fridge. I think you could get yourself into big trouble for writing a note like this in the office fridge. I think people might not take the joke so well. But if it was someone like a family member, maybe you know that you can get away with this kind of thing. You've done this kind of thing before in the past, and you've gotten away with it, so you can presume that you'll get away with it again. Which leads me to, I'll sort of pull back the veil a little bit and kind of contradict something I said just now about speaking voice. Being an English teacher and knowing stuff, I know an amount about the history of this poem. And this was written by William Carlos Williams, who was not a professional poet, did not have a job as a poet. I don't think anyone hardly in the last 100 years has ever had a job just as a poet, but was not even a teacher of poetry or anything like that, or a journalist. He was a doctor. He worked as a doctor, an obstetrician. And so he'd get up and go to work in the morning. The first draft of this poem was actually a note that he wrote to his wife, and he actually had eaten his wife's plums. So the idea of speaking voice is something that can help us maybe kind of separate out the poet and the words of the poem. With a poem like this, however, it becomes actually harder to separate them out. They can actually kind of collapse back in on each other, because this was actually something that he wrote to someone. This was a note that he wrote to his wife. Now, he wasn't a professional poet, but he was very much a poet. He'd written, he wasn't, at the time, he wasn't nearly as famous as he came to be. However, so he was an obscure poet. No one in the public would have known him. However, he was very famous with other poets. That he was good friends with a number of poets who were known poets at the time and have gone on to become very famous poets. And so he'd written books of poems. He'd gotten them published. They weren't, they didn't get the kind of attention and reviews that he would have liked, but he was very much a poet. So yes, he wrote this as a note to his wife, but he also at the same time was writing it as a poem. It was also doing two things. It was, communicating with her, but it was also a little poetry exercise that he was doing there. And I don't know how many of you have known writers or spent time with writers. This can be one of the very difficult things about having close relations with someone who's a writer, is sometimes writers sacrifice sometimes writers don't treat the people around them, close to them, spouses, family members, as well as they could. Sometimes they take advantage of the people around them for the sake of their writing. There's a famous novelist who's still alive. He's fairly old, but he's still alive, named Philip Roth. And I read a comment once about someone saying that throughout his life, had a very hard time keeping friends, because he had the habit of writing his friends into as characters in his novels. He used his friends, their personalities, and their stories within his novels. He kind of tattled on them. And he would these portraits of his friends he would make in his novels wouldn't be complimentary. He'd kind of like show them warts and all. And so his friends would get mad at him and stop being friends with him. But since he was famous, he could make some more friends after that. And so there's something about this, even though on the one hand, this poem would be a personal communication, at the same time, it was, when he did it, was a piece of art. So that even though you could say these are the words of the poet, that speaking voice thing came in just as well. Just the speaking voice came in at the same time. All right, and so one last thing before we close, I'd like to here we go. Here's our poem, and there's some things that that you want to point out here in the poem, just sort of going down from the top. One of the questions, oops, oh dang it, where's that? Okay, go back. Oh, this is not going to let me do that. Okay, here, look about this word here, just. This is just to say. That's, something maybe to think about. Why does it say just in there? Why is it not just this is to say? What does it mean when you say just something? This is just a little note. This is just something I was thinking of on my way into work. Oh, this is just a little something I got to tide me over. What does it mean? What difference does it make that the word just is in the title? If you want to think about, evidence based on just the words in the poem, the evidence we have that this is written to someone, these two people know each other very well, the person speaking and the person being spoken to, is this here, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox. Oh, by the way, icebox, there's a great old-fashioned word for you. I think this poem could be written, this could be a poem that was written today, except for that word. Icebox is a word my grandmother used. Not even my mom would use that word. Okay, so that's a statement of fact, and he knows that because he did it. However, this next part, which you were probably saving for breakfast. So there was no note on the plums, as opposed to like in the work refrigerator. There's, people put notes on things. This is mine, keep off. There was no notes on these plums, but the person knows the other person so well, the speaker knows the person spoken to so well, that they can see the plums in the icebox, and they know what they were there for. Not 100% sure. There's the probably in there. They're guessing, but they know the other person well enough so that they know what they were for. Then we get to our last stanza, kind of like where the things really happen. First off, we've got the forgive me. And I think this is an interesting thing to think about in terms of apologies. This does not say, notice he doesn't say, I'm sorry I did that. He says, forgive me. I think personally, forgive me is kind of a strange thing to say. I think, I don't have time to go into this. I think the concept of forgiveness itself is it's got some interesting things to it. But notice that forgive me, if you, as an English teacher, and we talk about grammar, forgive me is in the form of an imperative. It's a command. And we say it as a request, but actually if you think grammatically, it's a command. It's a get up, shut up, sit down, and get out of here. Those are all imperatives. Those are all commands. Forgive me is actually, even though it's said as a request, is actually grammatically a command. And I think there's something presumptuous in that. Okay. And then, as many people pointed out, what if the poem had ended with forgive me? What if he'd said, like, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold, forgive me? If that was the last thing, that forgive me was the last line in the poem, it would have a very different sort of effect. But the fact that he does the forgive me and then closes with this, what many people call the kind of taunting, and I think there is some taunting in this for sure. They were delicious, so sweet and so cold. It's that ordering there that gives the poem a sort of special twist. And I think one last thing too is this. Now this is when you get into you're getting the poetry, kind of attention to the minutiae of the words. Notice how the last these two adjectives, so sweet and so cold. Notice that last one, cold. What if it was different? So cold and so sweet. And sweet were the last word of the poem. There would be something that would have one effect, but to have cold be the last word of the poem. And think about that, like if you've eaten fruit, and have you ever thought that what you like about the piece of fruit is that it's so cold? It seems a very unusual kind of adjective of commendation. But then you would think about sort of the emotional atmosphere of the poem. What kind of feelings are within the poem? I think there's something interesting about the very last word being cold. Okay, and so, all right, and I will be doing, as I said before, I will be doing this after each one of our daily discussions. So there's this one, and there'll be another one I will do either tomorrow night or early on Tuesday morning after our discussion on the next poem. Okay, so I will talk to you soon.